The silence that followed surrender was unlike anything the Germans had known during 12 years of war. No air raid sirens. No marching boots echoing through cobblestone streets. No distant rumble of artillery that had become as familiar as a heartbeat. Instead, there was something far stranger, the sound of bicycle bells. In the spring of 1945, as ash still settled over the skeletal remains of German cities, something impossible appeared in the rubble-strewn streets. Children. Not German children, hollow-eyed and hungry, scavenging for food among the ruins. These were American children, well-fed, rosy-cheeked, laughing, pedaling bicycles with canvas bags slung across their shoulders, newspapers folded neatly inside. To the Germans watching from shattered windows and doorways, it was as if visitors from another planet had arrived. These young boys and girls, some no older than 12 or 13, navigated the debris with practiced ease, tossing rolled papers onto doorsteps with casual accuracy. They wore clean clothes. Their bicycles gleamed. They smiled. For Frau Margarete Schneider, a schoolteacher in occupied Frankfurt, the first time she saw an American boy deliver a newspaper to the military housing unit across from her bombed-out apartment, she thought she was hallucinating from hunger. I stood there watching this child, she would later recall, riding his bicycle as if the world hadn't just ended. As if there was still such a thing as normalcy. I had forgotten what that looked like. The Germans had expected many things from their conquerors. They expected retribution, perhaps cruelty, certainly the iron fist of military occupation. They had been told for years that the Americans were weak, decadent, barely holding their mongrel society together. What they did not expect was this: children at work, children at play, children being children in a land that had forgotten childhood entirely. These paper routes represented something the propaganda had never prepared them for: a glimpse into a society that had not collapsed, that had not eaten itself alive, that still possessed the luxury of allowing its youth to remain young. In those early months of occupation, as spring gave way to summer and the reality of defeat settled like dust over every German heart, those bicycle bells became a haunting reminder of everything they had lost, everything they had destroyed, and everything they had been lied to about. The Americans had not brought just military might to Germany. They had brought something far more devastating to Nazi mythology. They had brought the ordinary, mundane proof of a functioning civilization. To understand the shock that rippled through German consciousness at the sight of these children, you must first understand the elaborate fiction they had been living inside. For over a decade, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had painted a very specific picture of America, a nation tearing itself apart, plagued by economic collapse, racial chaos, and moral decay. The Americans, they were told, were barely a people at all, just a confused mixture of races and religions with no true culture, no discipline, no future. German newsreels showed carefully edited footage of breadlines during the Depression, of labor strikes, of poverty in American cities. The message was clear and constant. America was weak, crumbling from within, sustained only by Jewish manipulation of finance. The German people, by contrast, were building a 1,000-year Reich, strong and pure and destined for greatness. But propaganda is only as strong as its isolation from reality. And in May 1945, reality arrived on bicycles. The children the Germans saw were not starving. They were not desperate. They wore shoes without holes. Their faces were not marked by the haunted look that German children now carried, that prematurely aged expression that came from too many nights in bomb shelters, too many meals of watered-down soup, too many funerals. These American children looked like children were supposed to look. Hans Dietrich, a former Wehrmacht soldier, remembered standing on a street corner in Munich, watching an American girl, perhaps 14 years old, deliver newspapers to the officers' quarters. She was humming, he said years later. I will never forget that. She was humming a tune while she worked. When was the last time I had heard a child hum? When was the last time any of us had hummed? The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For years, Germans had sacrificed everything: food, safety, their sons, for the promise of victory and the Führer's vision of German superiority. They had been told their suffering had meaning, that they were superior to their enemies, that their cause was just. And now here were the children of their conquerors, delivering newspapers as casually as if they were back in Iowa or Massachusetts, completely unburdened by ideology or fear or the weight of a collapsing empire. The newspapers themselves told another story. The Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper these children delivered, contained something Germans had not seen in honest print for over a decade: actual news. Not propaganda dressed up as news, not carefully curated lies, but real information about the world. Articles about baseball games, comics, letters from soldiers to their families, reports on reconstruction efforts. The banality of it was revolutionary. Frau Schneider, the Frankfurt schoolteacher, managed to retrieve a discarded copy one morning. I read every single word, she remembered. Even the advertisements. Especially the advertisements. They were selling washing machines, phonograph records, automobiles. Their society was still producing things people wanted, not just things the state demanded. It was a newspaper from a country that was living, not just surviving. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. If the Americans were this strong, this normal, this unbothered, then what had all the sacrifice been for? The American occupation did not arrive as a single thunderclap, but rather as a gradual transformation that made the strangeness somehow more profound. First came the soldiers, then the military administrators, then the military government offices, and finally, in a move that stunned German observers, the families. By late 1945 and into 1946, American military dependents began arriving in significant numbers. Wives stepped off transport planes wearing dresses that looked impossibly bright against the gray landscape of rubble. They carried babies, held the hands of toddlers, and brought with them suitcases full of a world Germany had lost. Within months, entire sections of requisitioned German neighborhoods had been transformed into peculiar transplants of American suburbia, dropped incongruously into the heart of devastation. The Americans did not simply occupy Germany, they imported their entire way of life. Baseball diamonds appeared in parks that had recently been defensive positions. Military housing units installed screen doors and window boxes with flowers. Commissaries stocked shelves with Coca-Cola, Hershey's chocolate, canned peaches, and corn flakes, products most Germans had never seen and certainly couldn't afford. And the children came to these new American neighborhoods like ambassadors of normalcy. They attended schools established for military dependents. They formed scout troops. They played in streets where Wehrmacht vehicles had rolled just months before. And yes, they took jobs, paper routes, helping at the PX, running small errands, not out of desperate necessity, but because this was what American children did. Work was formative, not punitive. Earning money was a rite of passage, not a matter of survival. For the Germans watching this transplanted slice of America take root in their defeated nation, it was like witnessing a magic trick they couldn't understand. These people had crossed an ocean to occupy a conquered enemy, yet they brought their children. They planted gardens. They organized community picnics. They acted as if peace was not a fragile hope but an established fact. Dieter Hoffmann, who had been 15 when the war ended, watched American boys his age playing catch in what had been a Hitler Youth training ground. They didn't even seem to notice the bullet holes in the walls, he recalled. They were just playing, laughing, arguing about baseball scores I didn't understand. And I realized, this is what we could have been. This is what childhood was supposed to look like. The newspaper routes became the most visible symbol of this imported normality. Every morning, as the sun rose over broken cities, those children mounted their bicycles and rode through the wreckage, delivering not just newspapers, but a daily reminder that somewhere in the world, life had continued. Somewhere, children were still allowed to be children. Somewhere, the future had not been devoured by ideology and war. The geography of occupied Germany became a map of parallel realities. On one side of the street, a German family huddled in a half-destroyed apartment, surviving on rationed bread and potato soup, burning furniture for warmth. On the other side, in requisitioned housing, American families sat down to dinners of pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans, followed by ice cream for dessert. The contrast was not subtle. It was a daily, visible reminder of defeat that no amount of propaganda could have conjured. And nowhere was this contrast more stark than in the children. German children in those years bore the unmistakable marks of malnutrition and trauma. Their clothes were patched and repatched, often made from repurposed military uniforms or curtains. Their shoes, if they had shoes at all, were held together with wire and hope. They moved with a caution born from years of air raids and violence. Many had stopped playing. Play requires a sense of safety, and safety had become a foreign concept. Then came the American children on their bicycles, healthy, energetic, unburdened. Their laughter echoed through streets that had forgotten what laughter sounded like. They called to each other in English, that strange language that had transformed from the tongue of the enemy to the sound of power. Their bicycles, often new or well-maintained, represented wealth that seemed obscene against the backdrop of rubble. Greta Muller, who was 12 in 1946, remembered standing with her younger brother, watching an American girl about her age deliver newspapers. She had braids tied with red ribbons, Greta said decades later. Red ribbons. Can you imagine? My mother had cut up my father's old shirts to make me a dress, and this girl had ribbons in her hair just for decoration. I didn't hate her. I couldn't hate her. But I couldn't look away either. She represented everything we had lost. The envy Germans felt was complicated, mixed with shame, curiosity, and a growing, reluctant admiration. These occupiers were not the monsters they had been told about. They were not even particularly cruel in their victory. They were simply, devastatingly normal. And their normality was a mirror that reflected back the absolute abnormality of what Germany had become. Some German children tried to interact, driven by the universal language of childhood curiosity. They would watch the paper routes, sometimes following at a distance on foot, since few had bicycles anymore. The American children, for their part, seemed largely oblivious to the impact of their presence. To them, this was just a paper route, like the one they might have had back in Illinois or Georgia. The war, for them, was their father's concern. They were just kids trying to earn some pocket money. But to the Germans watching, every toss of a newspaper, every ring of a bicycle bell, every cheerful "good morning" called out in English was a small earthquake in their understanding of the world. The Americans had not just won the war militarily. They had won it morally, culturally, existentially. And their children, innocent and unaware, were the proof delivered fresh every morning. Democracy, it turned out, was not an abstract concept debated by philosophers. It was a boy on a bicycle earning money by providing a service. It was the free press those newspapers represented. It was the casual way American families went about their daily lives, making choices about what to eat, what to read, what to believe, without fear of midnight knocks on the door. The military families brought with them the entire ecosystem of American civilian life. There were Boy Scout meetings where children learned leadership through camping and service projects. There were church socials where people gathered by choice, not by mandate. There were Little League games where winning mattered, but losing wasn't treason. There were parent-teacher conferences, bake sales, and community bulletin boards asking for volunteers. For Germans who had lived for over a decade in a totalitarian state where every aspect of life was controlled, monitored, and weaponized for the Reich, this casual democracy was revolutionary. Children made decisions. Parents had authority over their own families. People disagreed about things loudly, publicly, and no one was arrested for it. The newspaper boys and girls embodied this perfectly. They were working, yes, but it was not the forced labor of Hitler Youth activities or the desperate scavenging that German children now endured. It was voluntary. It was compensated. It taught responsibility and money management. It was part of their education in citizenship, not obedience. Werner Schmidt, who would later become a journalist himself, remembered sneaking looks at the stars and stripes whenever he could find a discarded copy. There were comic strips, he said with wonder still in his voice decades later. Comic strips in a military newspaper. There were letters to the editor where soldiers complained about things. Complained. In print. And nothing happened to them. This was a revelation. The Americans seemed to take for granted the very things that Germans had been taught to despise: individualism, free speech, the messy chaos of open debate. And yet, their society had not collapsed into anarchy. In fact, it had produced the most powerful military and economy the world had ever seen. The equation didn't make sense according to Nazi ideology, yet here was the proof, delivered daily on bicycles. American parents could be seen chatting with their children as equals, not as subordinates. Families made weekend plans together. There was leisure time, used for leisure, not for mandatory party rallies or military training. The children had hobbies: stamp collecting, model building, reading books chosen for enjoyment rather than indoctrination. This was soft power at its most effective. Not speeches about democracy, not lectures on freedom, but the simple, daily demonstration of what a free society looked like when transplanted into the heart of tyranny's ruins. The transformation of German perception did not happen overnight. It could not. Years of propaganda had created layers of belief that needed to be peeled back slowly, carefully, through repeated exposure to contradictory evidence. The American children on bicycles were part of that evidence, appearing every morning like a persistent argument that could not be dismissed. As months turned into years, interactions deepened beyond mere observation. German shop owners began dealing with American families who paid fairly and said please and thank you in broken German. German workers employed by the occupation forces found that their American supervisors, while demanding, were not cruel. They were paid on time. They had breaks. They were treated with basic human dignity. And the children, those relentless little ambassadors, kept pedaling through the streets. By 1947, some German children had begun interacting with their American counterparts. Language barriers were overcome with the universal vocabularies of play and curiosity. A boy in Munich traded sketches of German aircraft for American baseball cards. A girl in Hamburg learned her first English words from an American teenager who delivered newspapers to the British American zone offices. These small exchanges carried enormous weight. Every interaction that didn't end in cruelty or contempt chipped away at the propaganda edifice. The Americans were supposed to be weak, yet they had won the war. They were supposed to be culturally inferior, yet their children were confident and capable. They were supposed to be motivated by vengeance, yet they were rebuilding Germany with the Marshall Plan. The newspapers themselves evolved in the German consciousness from enemy propaganda to sources of genuine information. Germans began to understand that a free press, even one run by the occupying military, provided something they had not had for years: actual news. Reports on the Nuremberg trials, on Reconstruction efforts, on the growing tensions with the Soviet Union, on American politics and culture, all delivered by children who had no idea they were participating in the re-education of a nation. Teachers like Frau Schneider found themselves incorporating these observations into their carefully monitored lessons. I would ask my students what they had seen, she recalled. Not what they had been told, but what they had seen with their own eyes. And slowly, they began to trust their own observations more than the old lies. The bicycle routes became metaphors for the circulation of ideas. Information moved through the occupied zones like blood through awakening limbs. Each newspaper delivered was a small transfusion of reality into a system that had been poisoned by fiction. And the children who carried them, innocent of their symbolic importance, just kept pedaling, kept delivering, kept existing as living proof that everything Germany had been told was wrong. What the Germans were witnessing, though they might not have had the words for it immediately, was democracy in its most fundamental form, not as a system of government, but as a way of being. The American children on their paper routes were not symbols someone had designed to teach a lesson. They were simply living their lives, and in doing so, they demonstrated principles that had been systematically eradicated from German society. There was dignity in their work. A paper route was honest labor, compensated fairly, teaching young people the value of responsibility and perseverance. It was not slave labor or forced contribution to the state. It was a transaction, work performed, wages earned, autonomy exercised. The children chose to take these jobs. Their parents allowed but did not force them. The system trusted them to complete the task without constant supervision. This concept of trust permeated American society in ways that shocked Germans. Trust in individuals to make decisions. Trust in the press to report honestly. Trust in citizens to handle information without the state filtering every word. Trust in children to be capable, responsible, contributing members of society without being indoctrinated into blind obedience. The Marshall Plan efforts, beginning in 1948, reinforced these daily lessons with massive economic support. But the money alone was not the point, it was the philosophy behind it. America was investing in Germany's recovery not to create a subjugated colony, but to build a stable, democratic partner. The idea was radical. Former enemies could become friends through shared values and mutual respect. In schoolyards and town squares, German adults began tentatively discussing these concepts. Some dismissed them as temporary illusions that would vanish once the occupation ended. Others, particularly the younger generation, seized upon them with desperate hope. The old ways had led to destruction. Perhaps these American ways, these strange ideas about individual freedom and democratic participation, offered a path forward. The children on bicycles had become more than newspaper carriers. They were daily professors in a vast, open-air classroom, teaching by example rather than lecture. They showed what it looked like when people were free, not just politically, but in the casual, everyday sense. Free to smile, free to work, free to be young, free to exist without fear defining every moment. And slowly, painfully, the Germans began to imagine that such freedom might be possible for them again. By the late 1940s, the bicycle bells no longer carried the same shock value. They had become part of the soundscape, woven into the daily rhythm of occupied Germany. But their meaning had transformed from a symbol of defeat into something more complex and hopeful, a sign that normalcy could be rebuilt, that the future was not irredeemably broken. German children began to ride bicycles again, not on military errands or Hitler Youth activities, but simply for the joy of it. Some found work delivering circulars or helping local merchants. The concept of the paper route, so distinctly American, began to take root in German culture as part of the broader adoption of Western values. A new generation was growing up under dual influences, the trauma and memory of what had been, and the daily example of what could be. These children, born in the war years or just after, would become the builders of modern Germany. They had seen both the depths of ideological insanity and the practical wisdom of democratic life. They had watched their parents' worldview shatter and then slowly, painfully, reconstruct into something more honest and sustainable. The American families eventually rotated out, returning to the States as tours of duty ended. The occupation transitioned into alliance. Germany, or at least West Germany, became a partner in the defense of democratic values against Soviet expansion. The children who had delivered newspapers grew into adults, many of whom never knew the significance their simple jobs had held. But the Germans remembered. In memoirs and oral histories collected decades later, survivors of those years would return again and again to those images. The well-fed children, the bicycles, the newspapers, the casual normalcy that had seemed so impossible. They spoke of envy, shame, confusion, and eventually understanding. The quiet power of ordinary decency had indeed rebuilt what war destroyed. Not through grand gestures or political speeches, but through the accumulation of small, human moments. A child delivering a newspaper. A family planting a garden. A society demonstrating that life could be lived with dignity, freedom, and hope. The Americans had conquered Germany not just with military might, but with something far more enduring. They had shown what it looked like to be free. And once seen, that vision could not be unseen. The bicycle bells had rung a change that would echo through generations.